Hello and welcome to the theatre. We are really excited. We've got a lovely next talk. My two favourite Nikolais in the room are going to be talking to us about acceptance tests, and I'm going to introduce them on stage, but first I'm going to read out the entire title, which is Practicing Acceptance, the Pitfalls. I've lost it on the screen. The pros, cons, and pitfalls of acceptance tests. So please give them a massive round of applause. Set the bar low.
Thank you. And welcome to our talk and welcome to Codegarden. We'll hopefully entertain you for the next 20 minutes or so, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I do believe some introductions are in order. First off, myself. My name is Nikolai Esben Heinautzen, also just called V1. That rolls off the tongue a bit easier. And I'm a developer on the core CMS team. I initially joined as an intern back in August 2020 and then kind of gradually moved into a full-time position in January 2021. And with me on stage I have...
I'm Nikolai Geisler, some just call me V2. And I started in Flowers, and now since August 2021, I've been with Umbraco. And I followed the exact same career path as Nikolai, because that's the rite of passage as a Nikolai.
Yes. So today we'd like to talk a bit about acceptance testing for you. This is really the accumulation of our experience maintaining the Umbraco acceptance test for the past, well, since I started as an intern. And we'll try and cover some of the pros and cons, like why you want it, why don't you want it, and as well as some tips and tricks and things you shouldn't do when writing acceptance tests.
Yep, but what is this talk about? What even is acceptance tests? Well, in our case, we're talking about automated acceptance tests that interact with the UI of your application. Some might refer to this as the manual acceptance test, but we're actually talking about the automatic ones, just so everyone knows. Our code examples will be in Cypress, but don't fret. All of our concepts and stuff is framework agnostic, so this can apply to every framework, not just Cypress.
Yes, so first of all, the pros. Why do we want an acceptance test? Hopefully you can take this to your manager or whatever and get some time to actually write them. But first of all, you will end up saving a lot of time with the acceptance tests. There will be an initial upfront cost in actually developing these acceptance tests, but you will see a return on your time investment pretty quickly. Now, for instance, back when I started a long time ago, I had done a couple of acceptance tests. And then Bjarke came up to me and said, "Oh yeah, we're going to release this patch a couple of days." I'm like, "Okay, yeah, can you do the testing?" I was like, "Yeah, fine." And then I got this Excel sheet, and it had like 200 testing steps. It was all manually, except for a few that had acceptance tests, and I was like, "Oh, yes, I just saved 5 minutes because I don't have to do this." So needless to say, after a full 8-hour day of just mindlessly clicking the back office, I was like, okay, this actually makes a lot of sense. Just think about when you're doing, if you're doing a lot of releases, every single day you have to do, every single release, you have to do 1.5 days of a developer or someone just clicking for absolutely no reason. Now, furthermore, since acceptance tests will reduce your cost in the sense of time in doing a release, you can also release more frequently, and you can do so with greater confidence. Now, historically, like I just mentioned, we used to manually test all of our patch releases. But now that we have a pretty okay acceptance test suite, we no longer have to, so making a patch release is no longer a 1.5 day event, it's like, I don't know, 2-3 hours and we're good to go. So this makes a lot of sense in the end. Yes.
Yeah, and they can also save you behind. So a little anecdote about our 9.3 release was that everything was merged. All the unit and integration tests were passing. We'd done a cursory smoke test and everyone seemed to work out, but our acceptance test was failing. Well, sometimes they are flaky. So we run those again, and they still failed. But then we had to investigate, and it actually turned out to be a critical bug preventing people from publishing content. So because the acceptance test actually caught that, we could fix it, and we didn't have to release a day one patch.
Thankfully.
With acceptance testing, you can also cover different cases. What I mean by this is you can test multiple browsers and different aspect ratios, for example, for a tablet or a phone and a laptop, whatever. But do beware, for every test case you want to cover, your test time will grow. So let's say I have all my acceptance tests, I test my laptop resolution. But now I want to test a phone resolution. So now I've doubled all my tests because I'm running it on both. Now I want to test it on my tablet. Now I think, okay, let's do different browsers as well. So let's do Chrome. Oh, that's 6. Let's do Edge. That's 9. So it really grows really fast. So just beware when testing different cases.
Yes. And one final thing that's pretty amazing about acceptance tests is that you will end up hitting a lot of code and validating a lot of code with only a few tests. Now just take navigating in the back office, for instance. We have a test like, can you publish content? Well, we'll start off on the front page, and then we have to navigate to the content, and we have to use the context menu. So now we know the context menu works, and all of these things. And that's just on the UI of things. If you look further under the hood, we'll end up testing services, controllers, mappers, a whole bunch of things with only a few tests. Now, this means that you don't have to, even while in the perfect world you want to have every single use case tested, you don't have to. You can have a few tests and still have a big impact. So there's really no excuses, oh, we need to make 100 tests for this to make sense. Just get started. Now, but it can't all be sunshine and rainbows. Acceptance tests do come with some downsides. There's no way around it. There's things you need to handle and manage to be able to actually gain something from these acceptance tests. And the first thing is...
You hit lots of code with few tests, but didn't we just have this as a pro? Yes, we did. But this also comes to bite you, because when we get an error, where does it originate from? Is it in the UI? Is it in the request? Is it in the backend? It's really hard to tell, but hopefully, I had a pyramid here, so hopefully you have an acceptance test fail, an integration test fail, and a unit test fail, and it'll be really easy for you to trace it all the way down. But in our experience, that's not the case. But here, you just need to ask yourself, why didn't I have an integration failing? Why didn't I have a unit test failing? And it may actually discover some holes in your tests as well.
Yes. Another thing that's hard to get around when we're talking acceptance testing is that they tend to be slow. If you compare them to unit tests, they're very slow. And the reason for this is that you have to test the full solution. So you need to spin up your project, but you also have to navigate in the UI, and in our case, that requires HTTP requests, which takes a time, and hitting the database and stuff like that. So before you know it, like, we already only have close to 100 tests, and this already takes 15 minutes or so to run locally. So if you have thousands, which we would like to someday, it'll end up taking hours. However, this means that it's not really practical to run these all the time. It won't be part of your development loop. But as I mentioned before, you hit a lot of code, so even a small subset of your test will bring value. So it might make sense to run your test on every pull request, or a subset of your test on every pull request, and so on. Now, we don't have to be completely content with it being slow. We can take steps to mitigate this. And that is really, you can paralyze your acceptance test. Now, there's two main ways we can do this. The first one is that if your test does not have any side effects, so if they don't affect any other tests, then you can simply just run a lot of tests in parallel on the same environment. But of course, at least in our case, this is rarely the case. So what you can do instead is you can actually spin up multiple environments. So you might spin up 10 environments of your project and run 100 tests on each for a total of 1,000. And that way it will take much, much less time than running them sequentially.
Yep, always throw more metal at it. Sometimes acceptance tests can be flaky. I mentioned in our 9.3 anecdote that they fail, and we ran them again because sometimes they just are flaky. And this is mainly due to the large scope of the test. There's a lot of moving parts when acceptance testing. And if one of these goes wrong, your acceptance test might fail. But we mostly found it's timing related. And what I mean by this is usually your JS might just be slow. Your page might just be slow as a one-off. And when you test, you try and go in on a page. You try to click an element that's not loaded. And now your test fails. And this just combines it to making some of the tests sometimes flaky.
Yes. Now, another thing is that, and I think pretty obviously, you actually need to run these tests to get any sort of value out of them. And you don't want to release something and then go, did you run the acceptance tests?
No, I thought you did that.
oh, damn. And then you just release something that's basically, if it's a patch, it's completely untested. So you need to really set up some sort of automatic testing. I mentioned a bit before, like what we do is on every single pull request, we'll spin up an environment in a Docker container and we'll run all of our acceptance tests against that. But we can still do this because it takes, 20 minutes on Azure pipelines to actually run these tests. But you might have so many tests that it's no longer practical. And in this case, it makes a lot of sense to potentially do it once a night or something like that. Additionally, we also run our tests every time we release something, just to make sure it's actually tested and I have a good feeling in my stomach.
Yeah, and acceptance tests can be hard to maintain. As I mentioned, when talking about how flaky they are, there's a lot of moving parts, and changing one of these parts might cause your acceptance test to break. But changing something in one of those parts might also cause it to break. So it can be really hard to maintain sometimes, but don't fret. Hopefully, we have some tips and tricks to minimize all these cons, even the hard to maintain ones.
Yes, and one of these is using data attributes. Now, it doesn't really matter which one you use. In this example, we are using data element, but it could be we also have some by label key or just simply an ID. And the real benefit to this is, as Nikolai mentioned, if something changes in your DOM, your test could break. But if you use data elements, it won't. As long as the data element doesn't change, or as long as the data attribute doesn't change, your test will run. Because in this case, Cypress, it doesn't care if what you pick out is a button or a link or whatever, it'll just click it. So as long as we keep this data element, for example, here it's section settings, so it's the top bar of Umbraco where I can click settings, then it really doesn't matter where it is in the DOM, it'll always just work. And if you contrast this with the one below, where we generated a selector without this, we can see it's dependent on it must be an A tag, it must be a link for Cypress to be able to understand this. And it needs to have a class called section name, and the text also needs to contain settings that's capitalized. So as you can see, this bottom one is a lot more likely to break, because if any of these things changes, well, it breaks. The top one doesn't have this issue.
Yep. And another thing, when we are talking about acceptance tests, they're not the same as end-to-end tests. This means when acceptance testing, you actually have to test the use case. So if you have a test where you have to go to some obscure URL, you might be tempted to navigate there via code. But if that's not your use case, you should actually use the UI to navigate and then test your test, because that's the use case, right? So just remember, they're not the same.
Yes, and our last tip here is that spend some time making some test helpers, essentially your own framework around your tests. Now this might seem weird because we're already using Cypress, why do I need to make more work? But in the end, this makes your tests a lot faster to write. And typically, the answer to the question, how do we get more tests, is make it easier to write. Because no one wants to spend 2-3 days making tests. Well, if you create some test helpers, you don't need to. For instance, in the Umbraco, what we use is a combination of builder classes and helper methods. So you can see the first example here on the left is if you want to create a document type in the back office that we can then do some tests on. Well, all you need to do is you need to create a document type builder, set its name, in this case it's just some name, and then just do build. The builder will then know, okay, I need to set an alias and I need to set this and this and this for it to work, and it just works. And then you can just say, save document type, and now your document type is saved. That is so much easier than having to go, oh, what was the API again, and okay, fill this out and stuff like that. The same goes with using the UI. Now, before I showed a selector for picking the setting, the setting section, we have also built a helper method around this, so you can just say, well, take me to the settings section, and you get there. So in the end, you end up saving so much time writing tests, but also if something changes, if for some reason our data element should change, so now it's no longer settings section, it's something different, well, then we only have to change our helper method. We don't have to change our 200 tests using that helper method, or 100. So this takes even more time up front, but you will save time in the long run. Yes, now we've told you what to do. Now we'd like to spend a bit of time telling you what not to do. These are some of the things that I think we both did when we initially started out with tests and realized maybe don't do that.
Yep. And the first one I have been very guilty of is overusing the UI. So I talked about acceptance tests and end-to-end tests not being the same and not navigating via code. But this is the opposite of that. Just because something can be done via clicks doesn't mean we have to. So let's take a use case in Umbraco where we want to create some content. We need a document type for that. And you might be tempted to go and create a document type via clicks. But you shouldn't do that. You should actually create the document type via an API, and then your actual use case will be navigate to the content section, create some content. So, just as I underline again, don't overuse the UI.
Yes. Another thing is that a lot of testing frameworks, like for instance Cypress and Playwright, they have some sort of automatic picker or record function that can actually generate all of these CSS selectors. And when you initially start out, you think, oh, that's amazing. I can write a test in 5 minutes. It's so easy. And you can, but your test will also break in 5 minutes. So we found that it's best not to use it at all. You can maybe use it for a bit of inspiration. And you can see the reason pretty clearly here. In the top example, I just used the Cypress test or element picker and go, give me a data type when creating a document type. And then it generated this selector, and it's like, give me the third child of something that has ng scope, and it's in Umbraco Codegarden. That makes sense to me. Then it has the second child that has a reset property. Now this is, first of all, hard to reason with, it hard to understand, but also if any of these things changes, like we mentioned earlier, your test will break. So now I've added a custom data type that maybe I've forgotten to delete or something. So now it's no longer the second child, it's the third child. Well, now our test is broken. But if you spend, I think I spent 5 minutes, or if not less, manually writing the bottom one, taking the top one as inspiration, going, okay, we have a card grid. Well, then you can just pick by attributes. So in this instance, okay, give me something in the card grid that has the title of text string. Of course, this could change. Maybe we will use a list instead of a card grid or whatever. And that's the sort of breaking test you can't really get around. But at this point, you're doing a pretty major overhaul of the UI, so you will probably have to rewrite a lot of your tests anyways. Yes.
And cascading failure states might seem fancy, but essentially what this boils down to is your test failing because it leaves behind data that makes another test fail down the line. So let's do an example again. Let's take the use case where I want to create some content. So now I've actually created my document type via the API like a good boy, and my content test is passing. But now I'm on a roll. I want to write another content test. So I want to create a document type again, but this time my test fails because there's already a document type created, right, with the same name. So what should I do then? Well, just remember, just as in real life, clean up after yourself. So after every test, you should start in the same state as you ended in. But what happens if my test errors out midway through? Now I don't get to clean up after myself. Well, we can actually do some defensive coding as well. So let's say this time I have a method that ensures the document type doesn't exist. And if it does, it actually will delete it for me, so my test won't fail, even if somebody forgot to clean up.
Yes. Now, I just heard a story of someone falling asleep at a talk. Hopefully none of you have fallen asleep yet. And neither should your tests. Because, as Nikolai mentioned earlier, a huge cause of errors and flakiness in these tests is timing related. So we've been guilty of going, oh, well, I just put in a sleep here for a couple of seconds and this page is loaded and everything's fine. But this is really not a good idea, because as I wrote, many small naps will quickly turn into a long slumber. So if you wait even for 2 or 3 seconds, but you have multiple hundreds of tests, well, now your test will run minutes slower, 10 minutes slower. And there is an additional issue with this, and that is, how long do we wait for? On my local machine, I have to wait for 200 milliseconds, but on the CI server, I have to wait for a second. So you usually do the developer thing and go, well, I multiply by 5, and then I wait for 3 or 5 seconds. But there is an alternative, because sometimes you have to wait. You have to wait for the page to load, because you can't click a button that doesn't exist yet. Now, the alternative is that a lot of frameworks, at least Cypress and Playwright, both do this. when you ask it to pick out an element like a button or whatever, it'll sit there and it'll wait and it'll keep trying finding the element until it exists. So you can actually use this to then pick out some element on the page. Maybe you don't even need it, but you know when this element shows up, well, the page is loaded and you are good to continue on your tests. So that's really the better way to do it. But now, I do write excessive user sleep because don't be too upset with yourself if you have to use sleep at some points. Because we have had experiences where the issue was not that the JavaScript wasn't loaded or that the HTML wasn't loaded. No. The issue was that the JavaScript haven't executed yet. And at this point, you're pretty much out of luck. There's nothing you can wait for. So we ended up just having to kind of chug in our sleep there and hope no one notices it in the pull requests.
The road is not paved with gold. You'll see some results quickly when acceptance testing, but it'll take time and dedication to reach something truly astonishing. But we hope from this talk you can go home with some tips and tricks you can apply in your own testing endeavors. Thank you for coming to our talk.
And we're going to take a really short break, a few minutes, and then we're going to have Corné Hoscom talking about Umbraco 9 and Blazor. So don't go far or don't leave at all. Thanks. Another round of applause for Nikolai's.